Welcome to Cornwall, or should we call it the Granite Kingdom, because this is the book we and the Pilgrim's book club were reading in July. It's a Cornish Journey by Tim Hannigan, and Tim grew up just a few miles from here. I'm in a place called Zennor, which is in Penwith. This is right at the tip of Cornwall, the wild Atlantic edge of our island. And Tim grew up in Morva, just over the way, I think, just over there. And he writes so evocatively about this landscape. He's poured his heart into this book. Maybe it was the book he always meant to write. And I'm looking forward to speaking to Tim soon on a YouTube live. So do follow our social channels if you want to keep up to date with when those will be and more news from the book club. And at Sherlock Pages, we really wanted to bring our reading experience to life by showing you glimpses of the book we're reading in each month as part of the Pilgrim's Book Club. So the themes will be what we do at Sherlock Pages: nature, landscape, history, heritage. I want to mix in fiction and non-fiction. We've started with a non-fiction piece. Next month in August, which I think this video will go out at the start of August, we will be reading A Little Trickery by Rosanna Pike, a fictional work set in the late medieval period. So that's what we'll be doing. So today, I really just wanted to give you a glimpse of what Cornwall's like. Maybe you've read this book and you haven't ever been to Cornwall. You didn't even know of it. Maybe it's been a long time since you went to Cornwall. I can't do justice to this huge area with its own distinctive identity, its own distinctive geographies. But what we can do is show you a few highlights. So this is what you've got to look forward to. One of the most striking features of Cornwall's towns and villages is the sheer number of Methodist churches. As they'd say in Poldark, this be a Methody place. But what is Methodism? In his book, The Granite Kingdom, Tim Hannigan tells us of John Wesley and his brother Charles, evangelical Anglicans in the 18th century, who were termed Methodists due to their rigour and application in looking at scripture and how they talked about it and the passion that they had. After an ill-fated adventure to the American colonies, the brothers returned home and soon began preaching. An evangelical mission was started. John Wesley, in particular, began to traverse Britain by horseback, by horse and cart, with an almost manic energy. And he found a particularly strong audience here in Cornwall. Indeed, he first visited in 1743 and would return no less than 31 times. No one really knows why Cornwall was so ripe for the Methodist message. However, this was an ancient land that had changed rapidly. Industrialisation here in the 18th and then into the 19th century in particular was transformational. Communities were dislocated from their traditional settlements. New settlements sprang up, and there was real physical and spiritual want. And it's perhaps not surprising that Methodism is also closely associated with former industrial areas of Wales as well. There's something about that fulcrum of industrialisation in these ancient lands, the kind of juxtaposition there that really meant audiences would come from far and wide to listen to outdoor preaching in places like this. This is Gwennap Pit. It is such an iconic scene in Cornwall. And the reason this pit was used, it's thought to be a natural depression that sunk even further under really old mines that crisscross Cornwall and are so common here. Because Wesley came and he spoke in a nearby village, but it was lashing with rain, the weather conditions weren't right, so they needed to find somewhere that would be slightly sheltered, the acoustics would work, and so they came here and he preached, and he would return many times. It's said that on one occasion there were 20 or 30,000 I'm just not sure how that's possible, but I certainly know that there must have been huge numbers coming out, and he would have electrified that audience. John Wesley died in 1791, but his message continued. Although he didn't necessarily see himself as a breakaway ministry, Methodism really gained its own identity and its own traction here and elsewhere across Britain, even across the world eventually. And by 1850, 60% of Cornwall's population were said to be Methodist. Seems an extraordinarily high figure to me, but from those people, like here in Cornwall and elsewhere where there are pockets of Methodism, were born some of the 19th century's great social justice movements. If we think about it, the abolition of slavery, education reform, social care, housing, conditions for the poor in general, many of these activities were closely linked to Methodists, and it shows that solidarity that was born in places like this, generated by really harsh conditions, the tremendous labour that went into the industrialisation of this land and elsewhere. And so I feel like when you come here to Gwennap Pit, you just imagine the preaching going on, a kind of revolutionary spirit that would have lit up in people, and you can understand how that would have sometimes disturbed the authorities. So if you have watched Poldark, that dynamic really does kind of make sense. I'm going to have a look around the little museum here and see what else I can see, but then I'm going to take you to one of my very favourite places in Cornwall, and it's actually the homeland of Tim Hannigan, right in the west, in Penwith, a really hauntingly beautiful landscape. I'm going to go to Zennor first, then hopefully Morva, or some of the ancient sites nearby where Tim Hannigan is actually from. He wrote to me just last night and called it his place. And then this evening I'm doing a speaking event in Fowey, closely associated with Daphne du Maurier. So I'm not going to be able to show you the whole of Cornwall. That would take a lifetime and more, but hopefully I can give you a flavour of some of the scenes described in this book, The Granite Kingdom. Just before I head off to Zennor and to Penwith, just had a cup of tea here with Peter, who's manning the little store here, the information centre, and there's a little chapel as well. And he was telling me that his grandfather and his father were miners, and I think it was his grandfather who worked on a mine in the north coast, putting up props, but the business failed due to economic changes and the price of copper and tin, I assume, and a lot of New World mining. And he actually went to India, and on this board here it talks all about this, about people from Cornwall, but then specifically this area as well around Gwennap, going all across the world with their mining expertise, and they were known as Cousin Jacks. So imagine there's a whole Cornish diaspora out there who originally moved to regions across the world to work and prospect in mining. So that was fascinating and really nice to just sit down and have a cup of tea with Peter. I was actually going to move on because I've not got much time, but then I thought, you know what, this is what it's all about. This is where you really get the value from these visits and speaking to people. So maybe I won't be able to show you quite as much as I'd like because I've got to get back to Fowey, but I think it's stories like that that, you know, are probably more valuable. I'm back in Zennor now, and this is St. Sonara's Church. Within it is one of the great treasures of Cornish folklore. Now, if you've read A Granite Kingdom, you will know that folklore and legend abounds on these heather-topped granite cliffs, this atmospheric, haunting landscape. It's no surprise that authors such as Daphne du Maurier really brought the landscape to life as a central character in their narratives. The legend that is associated with this church is the Mermaid of Zennor. The treasure comes in the form of a carved bench end, and this was worked some 600 years ago, and you can still see it today. Here it is. And the legend goes, the story goes, that the son of a churchwarden, a Matthew Trahella, was enticed by the mermaid who'd come up to see him in the village, whispered into his ear, and they were last seen swimming out to sea at the local cove just along the way. And if you do come here to Zennor, it's just near St Ives, which is a really beautiful village. In the summer, it is really overrun with tourists. I do have to say that. But if you visit out of season, it's known, as quite a few places in this part of Cornwall are, for its artists. There was an artist colony here. Barbara Hepworth famously kept a studio just along the way. And so there is a profundity of cultural life here to explore. And you can have a pint opposite the church at the Tinners, which I think is one of the great pubs of England, and therefore one of the great pubs of the world. Here I am at Zennor Head, and I wasn't going to come back on camera. I've got the sunglasses on because it's really beating down on me. But it called to mind a poem by John Betjeman, who I think often goes underrated as a poet because he was a popular poet. He was a people's poet. He wasn't always deathly serious, but I love his poems, and of course his love of historic churches really resonates with me. But ironically for today, that poem was called Winter Seascape, I believe. I'm not sure of the exact words, and I've got no signal, so I can't check, but I think the final part of the poem goes something like, "Here alone where the cliffs prevail, I stand exultant, neutral, free. And from the cushion of a gale, behold a huge consoling sea." And I know that John Betjeman, who's buried on this coastline much further up near Padstow Way, at a glorious church called St Enodoc, Trebitherick, which is in my book, Forgotten Churches, which I do actually have on hand just here. Yes, it was landscapes like this that really inspired him, and I can't imagine being out here when the weather's closing in, when the rain is coming down. Honestly, today when I was driving in, because you drive over the moors here, and the sea opens up before you, there was just one little sailing boat on the horizon, just out there. Doesn't quite look like it on camera, but I really couldn't see where the sea stopped and the sky began. And that set against just a slather of sort of greens and mainly browns, beige, and then the grey of the granite was just beautiful. Anyway, waffled on for a while. Let's continue our Cornish journey. Earlier in July, I walked the Saint's Way from Padstow to Fowey. This is the starting point. This is St Petrock's, a truly ancient place. Now, some of the fabric here dates from the 12th century, but most of it is 15th today. But it is recorded as having been destroyed by the Vikings in 981. Here is the campsite where I camped for the night, and I just thought I'd show you my setup. So I try and take as light a tent as possible when I'm on pilgrimage so I can tie it all up and then head on my way. This is the morning in Padstow, and Tim Hannigan writes about Padstow, says it's got that strange atmosphere where tourists are all around waiting as if Rick Stein is going to come out and give a performance, the famous TV chef. What is strange, this is the Camel Estuary, by the way, is that I actually bumped into Rick Stein himself as he was coming out of his garage. And it is quite a bougie place. Today you'll see the romance of the fishermen's cottages here. This is the bookshop in town. But I didn't have too much time to spend in Padstow because I had to be on my way and out early. Here I am leaving Padstow, the Camel Estuary, and heading on to Little Petherick Creek. This is a tidal creek, and the church in Little Petherick is quite stunning. It was the first place that I got to stamp my pilgrim's passport. And whilst the outside of the church isn't so remarkable, quaint as it is, charming in its little corner, the inside really is. It's been described as one of the architectural highlights of Cornwall, and you'll see all of this work by the famous architect Ninian Comper in the early parts of the 20th century. So the rood screen there really recreating the feel of a medieval church. I carried on along my way on the Saints' Way. Now, this route was created by friends in 1984 after they saw granite stiles such as that one just there, and they decided to link up the footpaths that would have been taken by early Celtic traders and pilgrims as they cut across the peninsula from Padstow down to Fowey, avoiding that long and treacherous journey around Land's End at the other side of Cornwall. Here you see the signs for the Saints' Way, which guide us along that route. I took a little break here at the St. Breock monolith. It has this beautiful feldspar veining to it, and is thought to be from around 2500 to 1500 BC, which would make it late Neolithic or early Bronze Age. This is the campsite which I stayed at on my second night of the pilgrimage, and I think I'm heading out in the morning. As you can see, it was already really bright and quite hot, but I was sheltered for the initial part of the journey by these shady old lanes, and I was really feeling quite remote here. It's in the middle of nowhere, to be honest, and there's not much by way of settlements along the route down to Fowey. And I actually made it to Gwennap by mid-afternoon. This is the church at Gwennap, and it was so hot by now. I actually sought shelter inside the church, was really thankful that they had a kitchen there, cooled down. But to be honest, I was really struggling with the heat, and a big shout out to everyone at the Fisherman's Arms who helped me out. They got a fan on me and provided me with some ice and some water, and I managed to cool down. But I called my pilgrimage off slightly early because this was a heat wave here in the UK. With the humidity, it can really get on top of you. As you see, this church was just fantastic. And I crossed the river at a place called Bedinnick and stayed the night and recuperated at the end of my pilgrimage. But I was soon back in Fowey because just a week or two later, I was giving a talk. Here I am looking awkward, trying to show you some of the streets of Fowey. Now, Fowey is so closely associated with Daphne du Maurier, who you may have read some of her works. She lived here for decades, most famously at Menabili between 1943 and 1969. We actually have a video on The King's General, one of her lesser known novels, with a literary agent, Becky Brown, if you check that out on the channel. Now, there's an interesting story behind this bookshop. This is Shrew Bookshop in Fowey, who I was doing my talk with. And me and a Gat very nearly took the lease on this place when it came up for rent 3 or 4 years ago now. Maybe it's longer, but it's very well run now by Kate, and it wasn't quite ready for us. And we're friends with them. As you can see here, they have a poster for the event, and it's probably about as big as Sherlock Pages. So if you're ever in Fowey, it's really well curated, and maybe you could pick up a copy of Forgotten Churches. I just wanted to show you some of the old lanes of Fowey as well. You see 4x4s, tourists going down here and scraping their vehicles. Do not advise heading down here unless you're confident. And the talk went really well. Just some shots of the estuary. Just a beautiful place to visit if you possibly can. Absolutely stunning. And we're so lucky with the weather. A little bit cooler on this second visit. I hope you enjoyed this little overview of Cornwall, the Granite Kingdom.